years now, as a person who is fully devoted and fully delighted as a follower of Jesus Christ, I've been interested in what it means to be a faithful giver. Not only that, but I've also dedicated myself to something that not a lot of people really care about or write about or speak about. And that is, how do we know when we have moved from simply being a faithful giver to the status of a generous giver? Today, I want to share with you what I have found to be the most compelling answers that I could find to these questions. But before I do that, I want to quickly and simply share with you why giving any amount to the support of the local church is an important spiritual discipline for every believer. Reason number one, I believe that giving to the ministry of the local church is good for whoever does it. Jesus told us to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven. Even if we don't understand this to be a command from God, we can easily see the reason Jesus said it. He goes on to say that by giving, we are investing in a heavenly savings account of sort. He promised us that not only is it the kind of giving to be safe and secure investment, but it won't be ruined by rust and worms. The person who believes that there is a next life with God in a new heaven and a new earth for eternity should want to know about this kind of secure, high-yield type of investment. Not only that, but my giving to the local church is good for me in another way. It gives me the satisfaction of knowing that I have invested into something, number one, that will outlast me. Number two, is bigger than me. In other words, it serves a greater cause than me. And three, is helping many people. Think about it. Instead of sending money to relief agencies, giving to the local church is preventative in nature. Instead of sending money to help the poor, or the pregnant person out of wedlock, the drug addicted, and the homeless, giving to the local church is an investment into people now so that they won't need relief help later. For instance, the local church encourages men to become better leaders at home. It encourages and supports women in all that they do, especially in parenting. And it partners with parents to train the next generation to be joyful followers of Christ and responsible influencers in their world. And finally, number four, giving is good for me because it helps me to say no to my selfish impulses. Some people call this disciplining the flesh. Every study I've ever read on the topic of generosity tells the same story. Givers are happier people. So my regular giving to God's work through the local church is good for me. Another reason for giving to God through the local church is what I'm calling reason number two. And that is, giving to God through the ministry of the local church is a good idea because it is good for the kingdom. I believe that the local church is the hope of the world. It is God's mandated instrument to spread the gospel and to help people become fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Christ. I don't have time to argue this point today, but I want everyone who is reading or listening to this to consider that God instituted the local church to carry out his purposes. That cannot be said about any other type of organization. Having said that, we are still left with the question that has been debated for years and years, and that is, as followers of Christ, how much are we required to give to the local church? Another way to state this is, what does God expect of us as givers? If I were preaching a sermon today, I would call this sermon the Sermon on the Amount. So, in the next several minutes, I will try to answer this question by sharing with you the arguments that have convinced me as to what the answer is. Let's jump into this. My best shot at showing you why tithing is that giving 10% of one's income is the basic amount of every believer, either so that they can grow to that amount or that they grow from that amount of giving. I think for most Christians in America, the standard amount from which they grow from is 10% and then become generous givers, giving a greater and greater percentage of their income. I feel that now would be a good time to give this disclaimer. I want you to know that in no way do I support the mixing of Old Covenant expectations for Jewish tithing with new covenant expectations for local church support. This careful distinction makes it impossible for any giver to use giving as a means to obligate God to bless him or her. Anyone who teaches that material blessings are promised to those who give are probably manipulating you, or at best, they are ignorant of the proper and basic rules of biblical interpretation. With that said, let's get into it. These are my thoughts on why tithing is a good standard for Christian giving to the local church. Argument number one. The Apostle Paul explained that it is our responsibility as followers of Christ to support the ministry of the local church. I will leave it to you to read all of 1 Corinthians 9. His argument for local church support is summed up in verse 11. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? And in verse 13 and 14, he goes on to raise this responsibility to the level of command from Christ himself. He says this, don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? Verse 14, in the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. Now, anyone reading this might ask, is the Apostle Paul telling us that Christ commanded us to support those who preach the gospel in the local church? Or is he saying that Christ commanded all who preach the gospel that they must receive their living from the gifts of God's people? Why do I believe that option number one is in mind? First, if Paul had in mind the second idea, it would mean that he immediately violated this command when he declared that he was not going to take money for the work that he was doing as a preacher. In verse 15, he says, but I have not used any of these rights. He understood the Lord's command to be for Christians to give, not for him to receive. It was his opinion that his ministry to Gentiles would be best served if he were bivocational. Argument number two. It involves what Paul wrote in 13 and 14, verses 13 and 14, when he compared local church support with the way that priests were supported under the Mosaic law. I will read again. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? Verse 14, in the same way, the Lord has commanded. And what has he commanded? Giving. Priests under the Old Testament received support from God's people, that is, through the giving of a tithe, or 10% of their income. So when he said to the church these words, in the same way, it creates an expectation that either we give support to the local church in the same way that those under the law gave support to the priests, or in the same way that they tithe support to the ministry of the priests, that we also should tithe. Either option has solid biblical and hermeneutical support. I, however, believe that option number two has more support, since he had just previously, made his case for supporting local church ministry. It would be redundant to do the same thing here. Therefore, I believe he is making a case for how much that support should be. It's not irresponsible as a Bible interpreter to think that Paul's comparison of Old Covenant giving might be a picture of how our giving under the New Covenant should be done. In other words, the responsibility is the same, but the covenant promises are different. Argument number three. The Bible gives us examples of other types of giving that are not commanded, both in the Old Testament and in the New. We find a variety of ways to give and a variety of purposes that are served by those gifts. You might know that when Moses was raising money for the building of the tabernacle, and David in raising money for the building of the temple, that they both made it clear to potential givers that this type of giving was not commanded. But instead, this kind of giving was for those who wanted to be generous and should only be done by people who had a heart for this type of giving. Listen to the words that God spoke to Moses in Exodus 25:2. Tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering for me from everyone whose heart prompts them to give. Why is this important? I think logic should tell us that if no giving is commanded by God in the New Testament, which is very commonly declared by modern authors, then why would the Apostle Paul find it necessary to tell the same Corinthian church that what he is now saying about giving in his second letter to them is not a command? In other words, giving to support the ministry of the local church is commanded in Paul's first letter, and now in his second letter to the Corinthians, he has encouraged them to give to the relief of the suffering of their fellow brothers and sisters. But this time, it is not commanded. This teaching comes to us in 2 Corinthians 8, 6 through 8. So we urge Titus, just as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, and in knowledge, and in complete earnestness, in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. And now, read from 2 Corinthians 9:7. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, not commanded. Let me help you connect the dots here. Under the Mosaic law, the Jews were commanded to tithe support for the priests, but then they were encouraged to give whatever amount they wanted to, as long as it was given with joy for the purpose of building the tabernacle. What we see are two very different kinds of giving for two very different purposes. Again, why would he need to be very specific in telling them that one is commanded and the other is not, unless the purpose of the gift dictated the motivation? The first motivation being driven by faithfulness to the local church, and the second driven by generosity, that is, relief efforts and other types of giving. Full disclosure here. I understand that these arguments might be new to many of you. Therefore, I'm asking that you carefully consider these arguments with an open mind instead of simply going with some preconceived ideas regarding tithing that you've maybe developed uncritically over the years. Now, let me give you argument number 4. Giving 10% of one's income has been done by ancient Near Eastern and Middle Eastern people groups for over 4,000 years, all for the purpose of showing honor. This 10% gift of honor was believed to be due to deities, to patriarchs, and any other benefactor. This explains why Abraham gave a 10% gift to Melchizedek after routing the Assyrians in battle. This story is recorded in Genesis 14:18. It says, Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Notice that Melchizedek has high status. He was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. Abraham understood that it was the right thing to do to show him honor by giving him 10% of everything that he got. It was an honorable gift. In a doctorate dissertation written to address this topic, I found this statement. The concept of tithing was not particular to ancient Israel. It was also found in other ancient Eastern cultures like ancient Egypt and Old and New Babylonian and Syria and Ugarit. Another paper used this title, Gifts to the Gods, First Fruits Giving and Tithing in Archaic and Classical Greek. In reading this paper, there is something that stood out to me. The author wrote this. This study is about one of the most ubiquitous and yet little studied aspect of ancient Greek religion, the offering of first fruits and tithes in Greece from 700 to 300 BC. This practice was a widespread and traditional custom found all over Greece and the Greek Mediterranean. These two studies on the practice of tithing are consistent with many others. The conclusion of my argument is tithing was the standard, honorable gift, and everyone knew it. Just like Abraham, Jacob knew it and committed to give a tithe to God. When he did this, there was no command to give 10%. It was simply the universal custom of how to show honor to your leader or your God. This is supported by what we read from early church fathers. Listen to what Irenaeus, 2nd century leader in the Christian church, wrote. The Jews were constrained to a regular payment of tithes. Christians who have liberty assign all their possessions to the Lord, bestowing freely, not the lesser, that would be the tithe, of their property, since they have the hope of greater things. The term not the lesser means that Christians were faithful in giving 10% and then went beyond that amount in their generosity. Tim Keller often makes a similar point when he teaches that if under the law people gave 10%, shouldn't we Christians give more? The culture in which the Bible was written and the cultures in which the early churches were planted are called traditional church cultures. In these cultures, the family or the tribe or the clan was of highest importance. These cultures were marked by a commitment to the honor of the family and the honor of the patriarch or leader or benefactor. Sometimes these cultures are called honor-shame cultures because the best thing a person could do is to contribute to the success and honor of the family. And the worst thing they could possibly do is to bring shame on the family. It was expected in these traditional cultures to honor the benefactor of the family. For a Christian, that would mean our God. This is why we read in Proverbs 3:9, honor the Lord with your wealth, the first fruits of all your crops. It was simply the right thing to do. And in 1 Timothy 5:17, the Apostle Paul connected giving of tithes to the ministry of the local church as a way to honor the Lord and his representatives. This is what he wrote. The elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. Here he communicates the idea that certain elders are worthy of double honor, namely respect and financial compensation, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. Why should we think of financial gifts or tithing when he uses the word double honor? Well, the answer to that question is this. Paul here supports this instruction with the same reasoning he gave in 1 Corinthians 9. Here is what he said in both passages, and this is a quote from Deuteronomy 25:4. You must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. Jesus said the same thing in Luke 10. So it doesn't matter if it's the Old Testament, New Testament, the Apostle Paul, or Jesus himself, the right thing to do is to give a tithe to the one you want to honor. So you must still be asking yourself, why didn't God think it was necessary to give a crystal clear statement requiring 10% of giving for the Christian? The answer to that question is this. He didn't think he had to. The practice of giving was understood by everyone to be the standard gift that communicated respect and honor. In other words, it was simply assumed by each writer of the New Testament, and therefore it didn't need to be said. Now, I know that this is an argument from silence, and I know that it's also not a bad argument. And with that, I'll wrap it up. I'm aware that I will not convince all of you regarding the standard of the tithe, but I hope at least that you are all more open to this practice now that you've heard my arguments. God will not love you more if you do, and he will not love you less if you don't. Everything that we enjoy as believers has already been granted to us on the basis of what Christ has done, not on what we do. And that's why we can have a command to give and also enjoy the privilege of giving. At the end of the day, we do what we want to do. And I hope that God will grab your affections in such a way that giving 10% would be a pleasure to you. And a life of generosity will be your life. Thank you for listening today.